You've heard of the perfect passive participle in Latin, but what is it actually for? Today we're going to look at what you can use PPPs for. Why do we learn them at all? So what are PPPs to begin with? They are the fourth principal part that comes up in your dictionaries. If you look at a verb, you should see this. Porto, portare, portavi, portatus. Portatus is your fourth principal part, the perfect passive participle. Let's have a look at what they're used for. They can be used as verbal adjectives in their own right, they can be part of ablative absolutes, and they can be used to form passive verbs. So let's start with verbal adjectives. This is a fancy word for a normal participle. A participle is formed from a verb and it declines like an adjective, hence the fancy term verbal adjective. This means portatus a is formed from the verb porto, that's where the red bit comes from, but it declines like an adjective, which is where the us a comes from. Now, why do we have several different endings? Because it declines like an adjective, it has to agree with the noun that it's describing in case, number, and gender. Gender is why we have us a masculine, feminine, neuter. The ones given are all nominative, singular. However, these can be every case and singular and plural. So these can change based on what they're describing. Here's an example. Feminae auditae discesserunt. The women who had been listened to left. Auditae is my verbal adjective. It describes the women. It's verbal because it comes from the verb audio, I hear. But it is just a normal adjective. It's describing these women. Because it's passive and it's in the perfect tense, they're not in charge of it. So you have to make it a passive sense. So the women who had been listened to by other people, they then left. It's describing the women, it's just giving us more information. That's quite a clunky translation of the verbal adjective, of the participle. So I could instead say, the women, having been heard, left. Or the women, after they were heard, left. Or the listened to women left. So these are the women who have been heard, they've said their piece, and then they leave. That's a verbal adjective. You pick whichever translation you like the most, and it's absolutely correct. You've got the passive sense, they're not doing anything actively, they are being listened to, and it is in the perfect tense. It's a PPP, perfect passive participle. Another use of a PPP is an ablative absolute. Now, I did a whole video on ablative absolutes, and I'll put a link in the description below. But basically, an ablative absolute is a noun plus a participle in the ablative case. Both the noun and the participle are ablative, and they're grammatically separate from the whole of the rest of the sentence. It doesn't affect anything else. You can take it out and the rest of the sentence makes sense. You translate it as with X having been wide. Super clunky translation, but it helps to keep the perfect passive participle sense of the ablative absolute. Let me show you what I mean. Urbe deleta milites dormiverunt. With the city having been destroyed, the soldiers slept. Urbe deleta is my ablative absolute. On its own, milites dormiverunt is a complete sentence. The soldiers slept. That's all I need. Grammatically, that is completely a full sentence. Urbe deleta can be taken out of that. That's what I mean when I say it's grammatically separate. With the city having been destroyed is quite a clunky translation. It gets my with X having been wide translation down, which is really good. But once I understand with X having been wide, with the city having been destroyed as the meaning, I can be a bit more fluent. So I could say, when the city had been destroyed, the soldiers slept. Or after the city was destroyed, the soldiers slept. All of those are perfect translations and you'd get the marks for all. I personally like to start with the clunky translation, and if I feel like it could do with a bit more fluency, changing it to after the city had been destroyed, or whichever I prefer. A final use of PPPs is in passive verbs. There are 3 tenses of passive verbs that need a PPP. Perfect passives, pluperfect passives, and future perfect passives. These all use the PPP to form. If you need any help with passive verbs, you can go and watch my previous video about passive verbs. There's a link in the description below. They are all formed from the fourth principal part, those three tenses, the perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect passive. They all then use esse in various tenses. So let's have a look. The perfect passive of porto is portatus sum. I have been carried. That is the fourth principal part plus the present tense of the verb to be. Pluperfect passives use the fourth principal part plus the imperfect tense of the verb to be. Portatus eram, I had been carried. And the future perfect passive uses the fourth principal part plus the future tense of the verb to be. I will have been carried. Now, portatus will change based on the number and gender of the thing being described. So if it was me, it would be portata sum, portata eram, portata ero, because I am a woman, I'm a girl. I need the feminine ending. If I'm talking about we have been carried, I would have to use portati sumus if it was a group with males and females, or portatai sumus if it was just females. So these all use the fourth principal part plus a variation of tense on the verb to be. So perfect passive participles, it's the fourth principal part in your dictionary and it can be used for various things. I think they're super cool and they make your translation so much more interesting. So I'm a huge fan of the PPP. Let me know what you think in the comments if you think I'm crazy or if you agree that these are an excellent piece of Latin grammar. The verbal adjectives, the ablative absolutes, and the passive verbs. Ablative absolutes do have a special place in my heart because I think they're excellent and the translation is nonsense with X having been wide. Fantastic. Peak Latin. If you're struggling with any of the Latin verbs, do go and download my complete reference guide to Latin verbs from the link in the description below. When you do that, you'll also get my nouns reference guide, which has all the noun endings, which will help with the verbal adjectives. So go and grab those from the link in the description below. Let me know your opinions on PPPs in the comments. I hope it's been useful. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time on Bambasbat.